Hello and welcome to EduCurious. Today's special guest is Dr. Jesse Jackson, and I've had the privilege of shadowing him years ago, and now I am so honored to have him as a special guest. So, Dr. Jackson, will you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do now? You've got a huge role and huge responsibilities in your current profession.
Okay, sure. So for the majority of my career, I worked as a classroom teacher, as a school administrator, and then certainly as a school superintendent in a lot of places throughout Florida and Georgia. My best experience as a professional educator was my role as a middle school teacher and learned a lot about myself, but I think I was able to contribute a whole lot to the profession by engaging with students at that age. And that's interesting because many people see middle school as the absolute worst grade period to teach in, but I loved every bit of it there. And quite honestly, my students taught me a whole lot about myself and about life and about the profession. So I enjoyed that experience at all the different levels. I moved back to Tallahassee and began to work with the Florida Department of Education, and I found that to be interesting. Worked in that for a couple of years, but during that same time, I began working as a consultant. And then specifically, I work as an expert witness. And so, in that role as an expert witness, I work with law firms from around the country that are involved in different types of litigation that involves schools and school districts. And so, that really is, I'll say, a look on the other side of education, because what I do as a consultant, expert witness, I provide expert advisement about the legitimacy, the rights or wrongs that people do in, unfortunately, in public and private education when it comes to management or engaging students. And so that offers a little different perspective in terms of what I'm looking for. When I was a teacher and or administrator, what I was looking for were ways to improve and enhance the work that I did or the work that the professionals that worked with me did in terms of engaging students and helping them to learn and to grow and to develop. In my role as an expert witness, what I do is scrutinize the work of educators and see if in fact the things that they did or were doing were appropriate, were the right kinds of things. And so again, that it's just a different perspective, a different look at education itself there.
I know there's a lot of negative stuff about changes in education, the Florida Department of Education on a national level, but give us some positives of what is good about the states having more control over the education within their area.
Well, the best thing about education, and it's always been that way, and it will always be that way, uh, are the people that make that magic happen daily in the lives of children. And I'm talking about the professionals, teachers and paraprofessionals and bus drivers and food and nutrition folks, school nurses, clinic people, everybody that's involved in that work that make that magic happen in the lives of children. They are the best thing, and they will always be the best thing. And quite honestly, it really doesn't matter, in my opinion, it doesn't matter whether AI and all those electronic kinds of things are utilized in that. It's that personal human touch that has the profound impact and effect on people's lives that nothing that we could create in a physical way would even compare to. And I'm talking about human relations. That's what I'm really talking about. And so it's like when I was growing up as a child, and I lived with an aunt and uncle. I wasn't raised by a mother and father, but it was that aunt and uncle, that human relationship that fostered within me that zest and that zeal to become something, to make life better for myself. As I saw them struggling, trying to make life better for me, and they had no real obligation to do that, but it was because of what was in their hearts and minds that inspired them to encourage me. And I paid very much attention to that. And as I grew up as a boy and then became a man, I recognized just how important that human relationship was for me, how it really transformed and changed my life. And it didn't happen through my mother and father. This was through a surrogate family. That human relation, that that person, that those people that really make up the school environment, they are the most positive about the status of things right now. And they will always be that way because everybody has a story. My story was one of hardship and difficulties, but it wasn't. It was really a story of intervention. It was a story of somebody coming into my life, an aunt and uncle, and making things different or better for me. And what I saw as a classroom teacher was that same role that I played in the lives of many children that I serve, of trying to make things better for them. And so it will always be that way. And they will always be the heroes of education.
So along this journey, starting out in a difficult situation, but then rising above that, what else have been some of your biggest challenges that you've had to overcome on your journey?
Well, again, when you're raised by family that, for instance, didn't go to college and you have aspirations, I had aspirations of becoming a professional football player. And so I knew that I was going to have to go through schooling at all different levels in order to get to that point. So when you're taking a journey where there's not really a roadmap, right? From a family standpoint, there's not really a roadmap. There's a lot of trial and error that you go through and that you experience. And I'm not complaining about that because really those trials and errors that I went through, they taught me a whole lot about life itself, about myself, and just as I said about the teaching experience that I had there, the children teaching me, they taught me a lot about the person that I was, but also they encouraged me to be a person different from who I was in order to meet what their needs were. So not having a definitive roadmap was a major obstacle there. And so what I had to do was attach myself to people who had a different experience, people that had parents maybe, or people that had advised them. I had to spend time with my guidance counselor. I had to I had to every Saturday go to the public library to engage. This is throughout my schooling as K-12 schooling. I had to go to the public library to learn, to explore, to study. And I did that because, again, I thought in my own heart and mind that those things would help me to overcome the things that I didn't have in my life from a family standpoint. And they did help quite a bit. I picked up books and read and studied things, and I tried to associate with people, again, who had like ambitions that I had. And so my friends and I, we would sort of talk about what our ambitions were and what we were aspiring to become. And this was even at the elementary school level. And so that was very, very important for me. And it certainly helped me to overcome a lot of the gaps that I had in my life in terms of, again, just not having people in place. My experience with my own children obviously was very different because I, as a parent, was able to engage them in ways that my parents weren't able to engage me. And so that was a testament to me, at least, of that importance and the value of that kind of engagement there. But again, just not having things in place and having, again, there was not like a public library in my community. I had to take a bus, a city bus, to go downtown in Jacksonville, where I grew up, in order to go to that library and to study and to read and to do those things there. Here, my neighborhood here, I can just go a few blocks and I can be at a public library here. I didn't have that as a child growing up. I had to engage in some special efforts in order to get to that public library. But I did because I knew that that was going to be beneficial, or at least I felt like that was going to be beneficial in the long run. And it was, in fact. And again, when you're raised in a family and in a community where a lot of folks didn't go to college, a lot of your friends have parents who didn't go to college, and so they don't have that experience either. And so, again, you have to coalesce a body of people around you that have similar expectations and aspirations so that you can do the same kinds of things. And so, my friends and I, as I said, we read and we studied and we did things together to inspire and to encourage each other. everything that I'm talking about involves human relations. I mean, it just, you can't get away from it. And those were the things that really helped and inspired me. I had a preacher at the church that I attended as a little boy that would take a lot of us boys to keep us from getting into trouble during the summertime. And he was the president of the longshoremen. And so he would take us and allow us to work really in the environment where he worked with the longshoremen and people that worked on the shipping industry there as a way of trying to keep us on the straight, keep us on the straight and narrow there. And again, that human relation led to me being able to not only work but to make money, but also to keep me out of trouble during those times when we were not in school. And that was extremely beneficial. But it could have been an obstacle if I had let it to be. So for instance, if I was a lazy person, didn't want to work, and said, no, thank you, but no thank you to the job, then perhaps I would have been on the street making poor decisions. But again, there was someone who sort of looked at our situation, thought, hey, it would be better for these boys to be working than to be on the streets during the summertime. And so I'm going to help them. The preacher helped us get jobs during the summertime that sort of intervened in our lives at that moment. One provided some income for us, but also kept us off the streets. And that was a major thing that happened in my life. And so what happened was I just really developed an affinity for working. And so I spent, even aside from the summers, I spent time working to earn money. I was raised by my aunt and uncle, and I was very cognizant of the fact that they were not my real parents, that they were a surrogate family that had taken me in. And even at a very young age, I was cognizant of the fact that they were doing something special for me. And what I had to do was to avoid being a problem for them. They had their own children. They had 4 children of their own. And so what I, again, consciously did was try not to do anything that would become a burden for them and for their family. So I was a good boy, I'll say. I really tried to do the right thing and to keep myself out of trouble so that I would not have been a burden for my aunt and uncle, who were laborers, but hardworking people, but cared a lot for me.
So this affinity for finding your own roadmap and surrounding yourself with good friends, how do you encourage others? Like if you're talking to a group of youth, how important do you emphasize those two things about like you've got to make your way? It's not an excuse. You have to pick yourself up and be motivated. What are
Well,
some of the phrases you like to use?
Well, certainly as a professional, as an educator, when working, for instance, as a middle school teacher, I had the honor and privilege of working with kids that were from backgrounds that were similar to mine. And I say honor and privilege because it was a special opportunity for me to engage those boys that I clearly saw could have been on a path for all kinds of bad things. I, again, as their teacher and an observer, as a member of that school faculty, approached my principal and said, "Hey, look, let me work with these kids." And she gave me the privilege, authority, the opportunity to work with those boys that, again, I saw that were similar to me in a lot of ways, race, demographics, and so forth. And what I felt like was that if, in fact, I could engage them in some positive ways, that maybe I could turn things around for them, just like my life had been turned around just by my parents, my aunt and uncle parents intervening in my life there. And so when you ask the question, what are some things that you would say? The things that I said to them were things that I knew were good things that anybody would want to hear. So, for instance, when I identified the group of young men, the first thing that I did was to say, hey, look, I need to put a positive spin on this engagement with these boys so that they can feel good about me working with them or getting with them. So, what I did was I contrived a letter, I drafted a letter, and the letter was to the parents. And the letter basically said, congratulations, John Doe, the boy's name. You've been selected to be a part of the Young Leaders Group. As a member of this Young Leaders Group, you will have an opportunity, and it lists a lot of things that these boys would be doing. What I knew was that if I, as a parent, received such a letter and my child had had a difficult time, it would make me really proud because I knew that they had been struggling. But all of a sudden, they get this letter, and this letter is a congratulatory letter for this child and saying this child is going to be a part of this special thing. And this child, as a member of this special thing, would be doing all of these wonderful things. So I contrived that letter. I sent that letter to the boys' families that I had identified for this group and waited on their response. Well, their responses were extremely positive because they had spent enough time at the school dealing with problems with that child. Now, all of a sudden, this thing has happened. They don't know whether it's true or not, but they're very happy because it's positive. Think about the impact on the boy itself there, right? So the boys that received these invitations to become a part of this young leaders group, they had had a lot of struggles. Now they've been asked to be a part of a leadership group. The letter had nothing negative at all in it. Imagine what sometimes people do. Sometimes what people do in their effort to do good, they would have said, hey, look, we want you to be a part of this at-risk program, for instance. So what's the difference? This at-risk program speaks negative. This young leaders group speaks positive. I had enough common sense to know I didn't want to speak negative to those boys or their families. I wanted to speak positive. When my aunt and uncle took me into their home, they didn't say, well, we'll take you in, but we'll take you in because they just took me in. When I took those boys into that program, there were no qualifiers except these are the things that we're going to do. And so when you ask the question, what things you would say, you have to think about where that person is and what it is that you want that person to do or to become. It's just like as a teacher, when you go in to teach math, science, whatever it is that you're teaching, hopefully the teacher has an idea of where they want to take those children to. And those ideas that they have would be infused into how they engage those children on a regular basis there. And they began to scaffold that up to a point to where they began to see that child transforming into that. Again, whatever the subject matter that we're talking about, and begin to excel in those things. We have to create a vision for people. When I began working with those children, I tried to create a vision for them of the life that they really want. Every child wants to be something special. They just all don't come from the same place. It's taking them to the library. Remember what I did? I took myself to the library to develop a vision for myself. You have to take people to that library, figuratively, take them to that library so that they can develop a vision that's way different. When I would go home into a community that was not the community that I live in right now. There were not a lot of things in that community that would take me to that vision. We, as educators, have to take people to that vision. We have to scaffold them up. We have to help them to get there. And so in working with those boys, that letter was sort of a template to taking them there. It was a sort of a roadmap. The list of things that I had that they would be involved in were things like this. We will celebrate your birthday. You're going to wear a shirt and tie one day a week. We're going to work with Habitat for Humanities. As members of this group, we're going to get together and talk about your academic performance. As members of this group, you're going to do these things as an outreach to your community. Who would have thought that a group of boys that had been in so much trouble could conform to that listing of things? First of all, most people don't even trust them to engage in really anything positive. They relegate that to the top students. How do you get a group of young boys that are not top students to become top students? You have to constantly inject and infuse within them top ideas, top behavior patterns that maybe they don't know about, but that you're going to teach them about. It's like if you're going to teach math and you don't know multiplication, right? How do you get a person to where they can do equations and fractions and all of that? Well, you got to infuse in them those little steps that will get them to that point there. And so what I knew was that a lot of the boys that I was looking at and concerned about, They didn't have the background, family or otherwise, that could get them to where they really needed to be. So what I had to do is I had to step by step get them there. What I also had to do was to help create a change of heart and mind among my peers, my professional coworkers, about who this child was. That's why the shirt and tie was so important in that process. Presenting them in a different way to their teachers, for instance, was a way to create curiosity within their teachers and the staff that worked with those kids to wonder, well, why are you dressed like that? Remember, these kids were having problems with their teachers. So their teachers saw them in a certain light. If I want that child to become something different, I've got to dress them up differently. I've got to create some curiosity about what's different about this person now, other than just the shirt and the tie. And so when I would have my little sessions with them, the sessions were not led by me, they were led by their peers. Infused in that body of students were students that were really top students. I did that purposely so that I could have some models that they could relate to. I mean, I could tell them as an adult what they should be doing. It's a whole lot better if they have a peer, a person their own age that's doing those things that they could clearly see themselves. And so I had really two groups of people in that group of students. There were those kids that were struggling, and there were those kids that were models, just absolute models. So that when we discussed, for instance, the importance of getting to class on time or coming to class prepared, it wasn't me talking to them or talking down to them about that. It was their peers sharing why they did those things. You see how deep it gets, what I'm talking about? So it started out, we just got this little group. But then when you begin to take it apart, you realize there's something a little bit deeper than just bringing kids together and telling them that they're going to do these things. You got to think about where they're at and think about what it is that you're trying to do or where you're trying to take them and what's the best way to get them there. And the best way, in my mind, to get them there was not for me to lecture to them and to tell them what they should be doing. It's to provide a real life model for them that was in their group that could say, not in a boastful or bragging way, well, because if I asked a kid, so tell me, John, what did you do to get that A? And they began to talk about the things that they did. That wasn't me telling them what they should be doing. That was one of their peers saying, this is what I did. If I had a session and we were talking about how to get over with your teacher, and I say, hey, look, if you compliment someone, then it makes them feel good. If you compliment your teacher, it will give you an in with that teacher. They never really thought about it that way, but I'll try that. And if they began to take on those characteristics of being complimentary and being respectful and being on time and all those kinds of things, they realized, wow, it works. This thing really works. What I knew was that there was no one teaching them those things at home. And so, in some ways, I became the parent, teaching them the way to engage in our society. And so, what do you teach? What do you tell? What do you say? You assess where a person is. And if the person can't do fractions or multiplications or whatever, you take them to the lowest level of how to get them there, and you begin working with them on those things. And so as a leader of that group, that contrived group that just came from nowhere, I just tried to think through how to take this person from this point to this point and began to infuse those strategies into their lives, so much so to that group of students became a model group of students for the school, for the entire school. This is a middle school. These were kids who had been the riffraff of the school. That group of students became a model group of students that worked with Ronald McDonald House, that worked with Habitat for Humanities, that worked with, their own peers that were having problems in the school, only because someone visioning what their lives could be and then infusing step by step strategies to help them to get there. And again, all we're talking about is relationships. They were sixth graders, seventh graders, and eighth graders. So what happened was this: when I started the group, as I said, almost miraculously, these boys began to conform to the standards that I had created within that group of students there. So much so that, for instance, if we were having a school function, a parent night or whatever, those kids were responsible for being the ushers. They would be dressed in shirt and ties, and they would serve the families that were there. So in a very short time, they developed an extremely positive reputation. Those boys did. Now, they developed a reputation, but people really didn't know, who are they? What are they all about? And how did they get to be a part of that group? And that became something where the principal began receiving phone calls from parents asking if their children could be a part of whoever that group of students are. The parents wanted their kids to become a part of the group. So the principal phone was blowing up with parents saying, hey, look, how come my kid is not a part of that young leaders group? It was, I mean, certainly that was not a goal of the program. It was just a byproduct of the transformation that was occurring in those boys' lives. But that was something that really happened. So the principal comes to me and say, hey, just my phone is blowing up. You know, I've got all these people wanting their kids to be a part of the young leaders group there. And so I said, you know, because she knew exactly what the program was really all about. I said, you know what this is, and you know it's not quite that, but I tell you what we'll do. We will allow each member of the group to invite a friend, a non-African American friend, to the group for the next school year. And so the next school year, our group doubled in size. And that was because each member invited one of their friends to become a part of the group. And so we continued again that pursuit there, but it changed somewhat in that now we have kids that have their friends that they invited to be a part of the group there. But at that point, we had sort of grown to a level where our role and responsibility was a little different. So instead of it being the transformation of the members, now it became a let's work on transforming the school culture and such that people are more respectful and engaging of one another, and that we didn't have those racial tensions and things like that.
Are there other big accomplishments over your career that you can think of off the top of your head that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Well, my style has always been being very personal and personalizing my engagement. So, for instance, when I was teaching middle school in Chiefland, Florida, one of the things that I did was I went to students' homes. If I was having an issue or concern, I would go to the family's house and spend time with the family trying to convince them of things that we can do together to help the child. And I remember taking that approach when I worked in Thomasville, Georgia. And in Thomasville, I worked as a school administrator at the high school, Thomasville High School. And so one of the things that I was concerned about, because my role at the high school was dealing with discipline and behavior issues of students at the high school level. And so I knew the feeder middle school, McIntyre Park, I knew the feeder middle school had issues, I'll say. But again, based on my experiences working with middle school students, I felt like there's something that I need to do to prepare for the new kids coming to school. And so what I decided to do was to pull out one of my infamous letters and to send letters. Actually, what I did first was I went over to the school. This was just at the end of the school year, and identified the most notorious kids in that middle school. And when I say notorious, I'm talking about the kids that were behavior problems, that academic problems, and so I identified those kids, pulled their cum folders, and began to study what went wrong in this child's life. And so what I noted was that going all the way back to around second and third grade was where there was this big change or drop off. For whatever reason, that's what I saw. And so what I did from that was, okay, so I said, okay, between second and third grade, this child changed, became a different type of students. And I say that because when you read the kindergarten, first grade, you read notes from teachers and it says a pleasure. this child is wonderful, works hard in class or whatever. So you read those anecdote notes from the cume folder from teachers, and then you begin to see notes that are very different around second and third grade. And then you begin to say, or at least I surmise that something happened. I'm not quite sure what happened, but between this juncture here, something changed in this child's life or in this child or whatever. And so that helped me gain a little perspective about the child. So really probably from third grade on up, the child struggled and had a lot of issues there. I wasn't really concerned about what happened. I was really more concerned about the fact that this child has struggled for a period of years and there needed to be a different kind of intervention for this child. And so what I did at the end of that school year, after studying that and coming to terms with what I was reading and studying, I drafted up a letter to that group of students, families. And the letter this time was a little different because this letter said, I introduced myself in the letter as an administrator from the high school and said that I would be making a home visit on said date, gave them a date that I would be coming to visit their home. Now that's being bold and brazen to take such a step with people that don't know me and that I don't even really have their students yet. But I did that. And so I send this letter to the families. And on the day that I said that I would be there, I visited those homes. And so the response was really interesting. Initially, for some of the homes, people wouldn't open the door, but I continued to knock, and eventually they would open the door. I would introduce myself, and I was certain that they felt like, well, maybe this is a policeman or something here, what's going on here. But after a short conversation, in most cases, they would allow me to come in and sit down. And the circumstances were not all the same. Some of them were terrible circumstances, and some of them were decent circumstances. But anyway, I went in and sat down with them. A few weeks later, they received another letter saying that I was coming by to visit. And this was probably about 15 to 20 students that I sent these letters to. So I went to visit a second time. And then they got a third letter from me. And I went and visited a third time. Then they received a letter inviting them to a cookout at the high school. This was during the summer now. This school hadn't even started. These kids had never even entered the high school yet, but they were coming. So by the time the cookout occurred, I had visited their homes 3 times, and then they were invited to a cookout at the school. Not one time in that whole process was there any negative conversation with them, even though these students had been involved in lots of negatives at their middle school, academic wise, behavior wise, otherwise. But I didn't introduce anything negative other than that I was just trying to help. I wanted to help. I wanted to be a resource for them. Now, imagine on that day. Now, and on the day that we had the cookout, really only half of the people showed up. That was a good thing. I mean, I wished all of them had shown up, but only half showed up. So there was about 7, 8 kids that showed up. But just think about it. Your child has been in this middle school, and every day there's been something going on that's not good. You're sick of hearing anything else negative about your child. You're sick of it. You don't want to hear anything else. You get this person from the high school coming to your house, not saying anything negative. You come to a cookout. The cookout was really like an orientation because these kids had not had such a good experience with school. I knew that their orientation needed to be stellar. It needed to be positive. It needed to be informative. It needed to be one where anything that they had on their mind we could discuss and I could help them with versus having this big glob of people and everybody's moving from one place to the other in a normal orientation setting. And nobody really is addressing what your child needs. And so that orientation, that cookout, it was one and the same. And what I found from that experience was I would be at a grocery store. A parent would stop me. Hey, Mr. Jackson, I'm Miss So-and-so. You remember you came to my house? It was a very pleasant experience for them. And in my mind, that was a better way to introduce that group of students that had had such a bad experience in middle school to high school. Because remember what I said in our previous conversation. Where you want to take this child to has to have a roadmap. And the question is how you get them there. The letter saying I'm coming was the first stepping stone to getting them there. The visit to the house was another stepping stone. The next letter, another stepping stone. The next letter, another stepping stone. The cookout, another stepping stone. To create a relationship of trust and respect. And it works. But again, initially you might think, well, that's not a big deal, but it's a huge deal when you're dealing with someone that had had a completely different experience. And so we just have to be thoughtful about what it is that we're trying to do and what's the best way to get to that point of whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. What are the best ways to get there? But it has to be very thoughtful. It can't just be from the hip kind of thing. It has to be something that you really invest time and effort into. One, knowing who that audience is, who that prospective person, student that you're trying to make a difference in their lives. And sometimes it's very individualized in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. So that experience was another highlight for me because it only reaffirmed the kinds of things that I've tried to do in the lives of children to make life better. And I could give you something much bigger, and I would call it the Lake Wales experience. To me, was much bigger because we were able to transform a system that when I started, the graduation rate was 70% at Lake Wales. And for people of color, it was lower. And I'm extremely proud of the fact that when I left there, the graduation rate was 95%. And that was at all races and cultures within that school system there. And that's a huge transition there. That's a huge transformation. And I remember when I started, I created what was called superintendent's talking points. And on that talking point, I noted the, the graduation rate that existed at the time I started. And I was meeting with Donna Dunson. I was saying to Donna, our graduation rate is going to be over 90% as a goal, from 70% to over 90%. And Donna looked at me like I had, four eyes, uh, thinking, brother, what are you talking about? We gotta get there. And I'm saying, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. And I'm gonna be with you every step of the way. But that was a lofty goal, 90%, from 70% to 90%. That was a lofty goal. But again, you have that vision, but then you have to think about all of those things that are going to take place or must take place in order to get there. And for me, the most important thing was to have the right people in place. You got to have the right people in place because in order to change or transform a child's life, you have to have people that are willing to have relationships with those children to get them there. If you don't have a relationship with the child, it's highly unlikely that you're going to change your life. It's not, you might change your life in a negative way, but it's highly unlikely that you're going to change your lives in a positive way. Starting with those superintendent's talking points and having over 90% as the goal for the graduation rate, we started on that journey. And it was a tremendous journey. And it changed a lot of lives there. And it made a lot of good things happen. And there was nothing that was happening that was accidental. It didn't just occur. It was very much contrived, conceived, planned step by step, an effort to move forward. And it was built on establishing the right relationships among the adults and children. And I give you just one example of what I'm talking about. At the high school, and that was the first place that I spent most of my time with when I started at the high school, even before I was hired on as a superintendent. I spent several days visiting the high school. And so what I noted was that, wow, this high school doesn't seem any different than any other high school. And I would have expected it's a charter school. There should be a little bit more discipline, order, structure, and things like that. But it wasn't. Donna wasn't the principal at the time. And so I would walk and talk with the assistant principal. I would walk and talk with him, the halls, and would ask him questions about, all kinds of things. But then what I did was I asked him to pull the data for student discipline. referrals, attendance, grades. And so when I looked at that data, what I saw was a handful of students. Just think about my young leaders kind of group. There was a handful of students that had generated most of the referrals for the entire school. And unfortunately, what I also noted, there was a handful of teachers that had generated most of those referrals. So you had a handful of students generating this voluminous amount of student discipline referrals, and you had a handful of teachers that were the writers of those discipline referrals. So you had this group and this group, obviously no relationship in terms of any positive relationship between the two. And we have a problem. It wasn't the whole school. It was this small group and this small group. And I don't ascribe to this idea that, hey, let's just try to reduce referrals. Let's just try to not write so many referrals. I don't, that's not me at all. That's completely opposite. You know, you have to grab that bull by the horn and deal with that. That was a starting point. That was a glimpse into there's something going on here. When we looked at those same teachers' grades, you would see that most of their kids, their students, were failing, making D's and F's. Well, again, I don't ascribe to giving students grades, but I do ascribe to teaching students so that they can make whatever grades they need to make that are satisfactory to them and to their families. And so as we, again, took a little deeper dive into that, we began to see some things there in terms of the relationship between the students, certain faculty members, and just what was really going on there. And so then we began to promote things, and Donna did it in a great way regarding getting feedback from teachers and staff about what they saw, what they felt, what they thought was needed in the school, getting feedback from students and families about the same kinds of things there. Donna would have these walls where stickers would be where from the surveys and things that had been presented to students and faculty and others, there would be points made from those surveys, which was very helpful to see where gaps were in terms of what people's perceptions were and all of that. And those information pieces were used to help really transform the thought patterns, the mindset, the attitude, the dispositions, and ultimately the relationships between adults and students. So, whereas they were that far apart, they were brought together. And that really is critical. When I engaged those boys in things that I thought was going to help them become better citizens, it certainly brought me together with them, but it also brought them together with their teachers and staff because their behaviors, their attitude, their dispositions became better suited for their teaching and learning process. And when Donna engaged faculty and staff and students into coming up with what's on their minds and why and when and what, one, it just put it out there that this is what I think, this is what you think. Now, how can we begin to think in very similar ways that are beneficial to all of us in this learning environment? And that means that people have to change. When I was a classroom teacher working with high school students, I became sort of bitter almost because of the insolent, disrespectful behavior of students. And I reached a point where, I felt like I needed to get out of this profession. About that same time, I transitioned to Tallahassee uh, and became a middle school teacher. And so all of those mindsets that I had working in the high school, I come into an environment, obviously, that's very different in terms of the age grouping of the students. Those students taught me a whole lot about myself. They helped me to change because I recognized their innocence. And they helped me to become a better man, a better teacher, a better person, really. And I'm saying there are experiences that we have in life, like I was talking about with Donna, providing, a forum for getting people to think about, what they think about, what they talk about, what they giving them that forum. And I'm talking about at all levels, students, staff, faculty, parents, giving them a forum to really articulate those things and to begin to see, okay, what are the highlights from all of this effort here? What are the things that we see are problems? And what are we going to do about these problems? As opposed to everybody's trying to figure out, we know something's going on, but we don't know exactly what's going on. And we don't even know how to find out what's going on. They had a method for finding out what was going on and getting people to articulate those things and getting people to agree that those things should be different. And how do we get there? And that was not blaming one group or the other. It was to say, how can we work together to make this better for everybody? And that's how you saw that transformation occur at the high school. So that, but again, think about strategic kinds of things, changing the start time, infusing all kinds of activities and clubs and things like that, that gave people a sense of belonging, helping teachers to feel supported and professional. A lot of stepping stones to that transformation. And that's critical.
You gave us 3 incredible examples of how you were able to assess a situation and provide a vision and roadmap for your classroom, then for your whole entire school, and then on top, an entire system. And you made it easy to understand. And that's where a lot of us are asking those questions like, well, how do we start? What do we do? And you were able to shed light on that. So thank you so very much for that. I feel inspired. Is amazing. But that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you, Dr. Jackson.
I appreciate you giving me this opportunity. And as I said through this, it really is about relationships. That it doesn't really matter what forums we use. Again, think about when the pandemic hit and there was this separation from the relationships. And think about how many people struggled and how much regression occurred, academic, socially, in all kinds of ways, because the relationships weren't there, or they were from a screen or whatever, and it's just not the same. It's just not the same. So anyway, I hope that I've been able to help you.
Oh, tremendously. And I know it's going to inspire others. So, whether you're a teacher, a parent, or just EduCurious, join the community as we explore various educational topics and learn from each other. We will see you next time.